The quiet before the storm. The late afternoon sun stretched across the horizon, painting the world in rich hues of amber and gold. It was a quiet highway, one of those rarely traveled roads that felt removed from time. The asphalt shimmered faintly in the heat, its long lines disappearing into the distance like a path into infinity. Trees bordered the sides, their branches swaying lazily in the breeze, as if nodding to the serene rhythm of the countryside. Inside a sleek, black sedan cruising along the empty road, Senator Malcolm Carter Ray leaned back into the plush leather seat, momentarily letting go of the day's burdens. He was a man who had climbed through the ranks of politics with equal parts charisma and grit. His tailored navy suit jacket hung neatly on a hanger in the back seat, while his tie, loosened at the neck, gave him an air of casual elegance. The car's interior radiated understated luxury, a blend of polished wood, muted chrome, and the faint scent of leather. The day had been exhausting, filled with back-to-back community events, endless speeches, and too many forced smiles. But this moment, cruising through the vast quiet of the highway, was his sanctuary. The weight of the expectations he carried, the hopes of his constituents, the demands of his office, momentarily lifted. As the road stretched ahead of him, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From humble beginnings in a working-class neighborhood to one of the most influential positions in the country, every step had been hard-earned. But even in this solitude, there was no true escape. For a black man in America, especially one of prominence, the shadow of prejudice loomed omnipresent. Malcolm had learned to navigate this reality with grace, using his intellect and demeanor to disarm those who underestimated him. Yet, there were moments when the veneer of progress peeled away, revealing the raw and bitter truths beneath. As he drove, his thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of an engine behind him. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of a patrol car in the distance. It wasn't unusual to see law enforcement on the road, but something about the way the cruiser lingered sent a ripple of unease through him. It trailed him at a steady distance, neither approaching nor falling back. Unbeknownst to Malcolm, the patrol car wasn't simply passing by. Inside, Officer Brad Nichols leaned forward in the driver's seat, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the sedan with a scrutiny that bordered on predatory. Nichols was a seasoned cop, his stocky build and gruff demeanor a reflection of his years in law enforcement. But his record was checkered, marked by complaints that often disappeared under the weight of departmental bureaucracy. His instincts, which he liked to tout as razor-sharp, were often fueled more by bias than by reason. Next to him sat his rookie partner, Officer Ethan Taylor. Taylor was fresh out of the academy, his clean-cut appearance and stiff posture a stark contrast to Nichols' rumpled uniform and jaded swagger. Taylor's unease was palpable as he glanced between the sleek sedan ahead and his partner's hawk-like focus. "You see that?" Nichols muttered, his voice low but charged with insinuation. He gestured subtly toward the sedan. "Black guy. Fancy car. Middle of nowhere. What do you think he's up to?" Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, hesitating before replying. "Could just be heading home. It's a quiet road." Nichols cut him off with a derisive chuckle. "Come on, kid. You don't get far in this job by being naive. Trust me. Guys like that? Always up to something." Taylor frowned but said nothing. He didn't agree with Nichols' logic, but as a rookie, he wasn't in a position to challenge his senior. He shifted his gaze back to the sedan, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Nichols reached for the cruiser's lights, flipping the switch with practiced ease. The siren blared to life, slicing through the tranquil evening air like a knife. The abruptness of the sound made Taylor flinch, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat. Ahead, the sedan slowed, signaling to pull over. Inside the car, Malcolm's fingers gripped the steering wheel a fraction tighter. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from a deep-seated frustration he had trained himself to suppress. He signaled and steered to the shoulder, parking neatly before taking a slow breath to steady himself. This wasn't new. He had been here before, too many times to count. In the side mirror, he watched as Officer Nichols emerged from the cruiser, his stride purposeful and his body language exuding authority. Behind him, Officer Taylor followed hesitantly, his eyes darting nervously. Malcolm took another breath and rolled down his window, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Nichols approached with a practiced swagger, his hand resting casually on the holster at his hip. He leaned slightly toward the open window, his shadow falling over Malcolm. "Evening," Nichols said, his tone sharp and deliberate. His eyes swept over Malcolm's face, then over the interior of the car, lingering on the expensive details. "License and registration." Malcolm met Nichols' gaze with calm composure, his voice steady. "Certainly, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Nichols smirked, the corner of his mouth curling upward. "Routine check." "You were driving, suspiciously." Malcolm raised an eyebrow but said nothing, reaching for his wallet with deliberate, slow movements. He had learned to be cautious, to avoid any sudden actions that could be misinterpreted. He handed over his license and registration, his hands steady despite the simmering tension in the air. As Nichols scrutinized the documents, Malcolm spoke again, his tone even but firm. "Officer, I'm Senator Malcolm Ray. I've just finished attending a community event and am heading back to the city." Nichols' expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, irritation, skepticism, passed through his eyes. He handed the documents to Taylor without a word, gesturing for him to run the information. Taylor hesitated but nodded, retreating to the cruiser. "Senator, huh?" Nichols said, leaning closer. "Fancy title. Doesn't mean you're above the law." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he forced a polite smile. "I wouldn't presume to be." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Around them, the highway remained eerily quiet, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the scene. Nichols straightened, his posture stiffening as he seemed to size Malcolm up. "Stay here," he barked, turning on his heel to join Taylor at the cruiser. Malcolm watched him go, his calm exterior masking the storm of emotions brewing within. This wasn't just about him, it was about the systemic biases that countless others faced daily. He had learned to navigate these moments with poise, but it didn't make them any less infuriating. In the cruiser, Taylor sat with his hands hovering over the keyboard, hesitating. "His record's clean," he said finally, glancing at Nichols. "No warrants, no violations." Nichols frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. He wasn't satisfied. "Run the plates again. Check everything." Taylor hesitated, sensing that this wasn't about protocol anymore. But he complied, his fingers moving reluctantly over the keys. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, the golden hues giving way to a soft orange glow. The quiet tension stretched on, an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing second. Back in his car, Malcolm's mind raced. He knew how this would look if things escalated. The senator pulled over on an empty road, targeted by officers fueled by baseless suspicion. He also knew he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not here. Not now. But deep down, he felt it, the weight of injustice pressing against his chest like a vice. And outside, as the shadows grew longer, the storm that had been brewing silently began to stir. The gathering storm. As the sun dipped lower, surrendering the highway to the cool embrace of twilight, Malcolm sat in the stillness of his sedan. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers drumming lightly in an unconscious rhythm. Years of experience had taught him how to navigate moments like this, remain calm, stay composed, and let the truth speak louder than suspicion. Yet, no matter how many times he endured such encounters, the weight of them never diminished. The distant sound of the patrol car's engine idling was a constant hum in the background, a reminder of the authority lingering behind him. Malcolm shifted slightly in his seat, glancing in the side mirror. He could see the officers in their cruiser. The younger one, Officer Taylor, seemed agitated, his movements quick and uncertain as he worked at the computer. The older one, Officer Nichols, stood outside the car, arms crossed, his silhouette painted in sharp lines by the fading light. Nichols turned, his gaze piercing and unrelenting, and began walking back toward Malcolm's vehicle. His heavy boots crunched against the gravel of the shoulder, each step measured and deliberate. There was an unmistakable air of control in his posture, a quiet declaration of power. Malcolm adjusted his tie, tightening it slightly as he prepared for the next exchange. The movement was as much about composure as it was about defiance, a silent statement that no one could strip him of his dignity. Nichols stopped just short of the window, his shadow falling across Malcolm once again. "Step out of the car," he said, his tone flat and authoritative. Malcolm's brow furrowed slightly. "Is there a specific reason for this request, officer?" Nichols tilted his head, the faintest smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Standard procedure. We've got to be thorough." Malcolm hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing his options. He knew the risks of escalation. A single misstep, a slight challenge to the officer's authority, could turn a tense situation volatile. With a controlled breath, he pushed open the door and stepped out. The cool evening air greeted him, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and asphalt. Malcolm stood tall, his tailored shirt and slacks immaculate even in the fading light. Despite the circumstances, he exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of public service and countless encounters like this one. Nichols took a step closer, his eyes scanning Malcolm from head to toe. "You seem awfully calm for someone being pulled over. Most people would be a little more concerned." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "I believe in letting the truth speak for itself, Officer Nichols." The mention of his name caused a flicker of surprise to cross Nichols' face, quickly replaced by a scowl. "How do you know my name?" "It's on your badge," Malcolm said smoothly. "As a public servant, I make it a point to notice the details." Nichols' scowl deepened, and his hand drifted toward the holster at his hip. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the movement, but his expression remained neutral. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible thread stretched taut. Behind them, Officer Taylor had stepped out of the cruiser, his uncertainty evident in the way he hovered near the car. He watched the exchange, his brow furrowed. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The senator wasn't acting like someone with something to hide. If anything, he seemed more composed than Nichols, who was clearly spoiling for a confrontation. "Officer Taylor," Malcolm called, his voice calm but firm. "Would you mind coming over here?" Taylor hesitated, glancing at Nichols, who shot him a glare. But the young officer's instincts pushed him forward. He approached cautiously, his gaze darting between his partner and the senator. "Yes, sir," Taylor said, his voice slightly strained. "Would you be so kind as to explain why I was pulled over?" Malcolm asked, his tone polite but laced with a quiet authority. Taylor opened his mouth to speak, but Nichols cut him off. "That's enough," he barked. "You don't get to dictate how this goes, Senator." The word dripped with disdain, as though Malcolm's title was a personal affront. Nichols stepped closer, his posture looming. "We ask the questions. You answer. That's how this works." Malcolm didn't flinch. Instead, he folded his hands in front of him, a picture of patience and resolve. "I've answered your questions, Officer Nichols. I've complied with every request. Yet, you've provided no justification for this stop. Am I free to go?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Nichols' jaw tightened, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who carried themselves with such calm authority. Before Nichols could respond, a new sound cut through the tension, a distant but unmistakable rumble of engines. Both officers and Malcolm turned toward the source. Two vehicles were approaching from the distance, their headlights piercing the growing darkness. As the cars drew closer, they slowed, and Malcolm could see faces peering out of the windows, curious and concerned. It wasn't long before one of the cars pulled to the side of the road a few yards away. A woman stepped out, phone in hand, her expression a mix of caution and determination. "Is everything okay here?" she called, her voice carrying across the open space. Nichols stiffened, his irritation evident. "This is a private matter, ma'am. Move along." The woman didn't budge. Instead, she held up her phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. "I just want to make sure everything's on the up and up. You know, for everyone's safety." Her words were a thinly veiled warning, and Nichols knew it. His scowl deepened, but he said nothing, his hand reluctantly moving away from his holster. More cars began to slow as they passed, some stopping entirely. People leaned out of windows, their phones raised, their curiosity turning to silent solidarity. Malcolm's heart swelled with an odd mix of hope and sadness. These strangers, most of whom he would never meet, were stepping into the moment, their presence a reminder of the collective strength in standing against injustice. Nichols, however, saw it differently. To him, the growing crowd was a challenge to his authority, a direct threat to his control of the situation. He turned to Malcolm, his voice a low growl. "You think this changes anything? You think these people will save you?" The turning tide. The hum of the highway had given way to a low murmur of voices. What had been a solitary, quiet road now carried the pulse of gathered strangers, observers who had become unintentional witnesses. Their headlights painted streaks of light across the darkening sky, illuminating the scene like an impromptu theater stage. Senator Malcolm Ray stood at its center, composed but alert, while officers Brad Nichols and Ethan Taylor hovered nearby, their authority now tempered by the presence of a growing audience. Malcolm could feel the shift in the air, a quiet but potent tension crackling around him. He was no stranger to moments like this, where a single misstep could tip the scales toward chaos. Yet, tonight felt different. The presence of others, those armed not with weapons but with cameras and questions, was a testament to a changing world, one where power no longer operated in absolute secrecy. Nichols, however, seemed unfazed by the growing crowd. If anything, the watchful eyes only fueled his determination to maintain control. His body language screamed defiance, arms crossed, chest puffed out, eyes locked on Malcolm with a mixture of disdain and challenge. "You've got yourself an audience now, Senator," Nichols sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is this what you wanted? A spectacle?" Malcolm didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he kept his voice measured, every word chosen with care. "What I want, Officer Nichols, is fairness. What I expect is transparency. And what I demand is respect, for myself and for the people watching." Nichols' smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He took a step closer, invading Malcolm's space with a deliberate air of intimidation. "You don't demand anything from me. Out here, I make the rules." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Malcolm didn't miss the way Nichols' hand hovered near his belt. He knew he had to tread carefully. This was a man who equated authority with dominance, and any perceived challenge could escalate the situation. Behind Nichols, Officer Taylor shifted uneasily, his posture rigid with uncertainty. He had watched his partner take the lead, but the rookie could no longer ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. The senator's calm demeanor, the lack of any visible wrongdoing, the spectators documenting every moment, it all painted a picture that didn't match the narrative Nichols seemed determined to create. "Brad," Taylor said hesitantly, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Maybe we should step back. Reassess." Nichols shot him a glare that could have frozen fire. "Reassess," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You want to reassess now? You think this guy gets a free pass because he's got a title and some spectators?" Taylor swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I just think we need to be sure we're doing this by the book." Nichols took a step back, his expression darkening as he turned to fully face his younger partner. For a moment, Malcolm saw the divide between the two officers, a rift that spoke volumes. Taylor's hesitation wasn't just about following protocol, it was about confronting a fundamental question: what kind of officer did he want to be? "You don't get it, do you?" Nichols said, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't about books. It's about instincts. My instincts tell me there's something off here. And what if your instincts are wrong?" Taylor shot back, surprising even himself with the force of his words. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, a wave of support for Taylor's unexpected defiance. Malcolm watched the exchange carefully, his mind racing as he weighed his options. There was an opportunity here, a chance to shift the narrative, to guide this confrontation toward resolution rather than escalation. "Officer Taylor," Malcolm said, addressing the rookie directly, his voice steady and deliberate. "I appreciate your commitment to doing what's right. It takes courage to speak up, especially in a moment like this." Taylor turned toward him, his face a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. The senator's calm acknowledgement seemed to ground him, giving him a clarity he hadn't felt before. Nichols, however, wasn't ready to back down. He turned on Malcolm with renewed aggression, his finger pointing like a dagger. "You don't get to play mediator here. You don't get to decide how this ends." "I'm not trying to decide anything, Officer Nichols," Malcolm replied evenly. "I'm simply reminding you, and everyone here, that accountability matters. For all of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing bolder as the tension mounted. Phones stayed raised, capturing every word, every gesture. The light from the devices reflected off Malcolm's face, illuminating the quiet strength in his expression. Nichols took a step closer, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a title and some cameras on you," he hissed. "I've seen plenty of guys like you, thinking you're above the law, thinking you can walk away from this without consequence." Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly, his composure unshaken. "And I've seen plenty of people in positions of power misuse it. But tonight, Officer Nichols, it's not just my integrity being tested, it's yours." The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Nichols hesitated. The crowd murmured again, the weight of their presence pressing down on him. He knew he was being watched, not just by strangers but by a world that would demand answers. Taylor stepped forward, his voice firmer now. "Senator Ray's information checked out. He's clean. There's no reason to detain him further." Nichols turned to his partner, his expression incredulous. "You're siding with him?" "I'm siding with the truth," Taylor said, his voice gaining strength. "This isn't what we're supposed to stand for, Brad." The divide between the two officers was now impossible to ignore. Nichols looked between Taylor and Malcolm, his face a mask of anger and frustration. The authority he had wielded so easily just moments ago now felt fragile, slipping through his fingers like sand. The crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, their applause growing into a wave of support for the senator and the young officer who had dared to question the status quo. Malcolm took a step forward, his voice cutting through the applause like a beacon. "Officer Nichols, you have a choice to make tonight. You can double down on suspicion and let this escalate, or you can recognize the power in doing what's right. The world is watching. But more importantly, so is your conscience." Nichols stared at him, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, his frustration boiling over into action. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him as the reality of the situation set in. Without a word, he turned and walked back toward the cruiser, his movements heavy with defeat. Taylor watched him go, a mixture of relief and sadness etched into his young face. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. The crowd erupted into cheers, their collective energy a testament to the power of standing together against injustice. As the officers returned to their vehicle, the senator turned to the crowd, offering a quiet smile of gratitude. He knew this moment would ripple outward, its impact felt far beyond this quiet highway. And as he stepped back into his car, the weight of the night lifted just slightly, replaced by the hope that change was not just possible, but inevitable. The reckoning. The drive back to his home wasn't the quiet retreat Malcolm Ray had envisioned when he first began his journey that evening. Instead, it was filled with the lingering echoes of what had just transpired, a battle of principles played out under the watchful gaze of strangers. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but his thoughts churned with a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and a strange sense of triumph. Behind him, the faint glow of headlights from a few lingering cars persisted. Members of the crowd, moved by his composure and conviction, had decided to follow for a short distance, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Though Malcolm appreciated their support, he yearned for solitude. The night had stripped his patience thin, and he needed space to recalibrate before deciding his next move. As he pulled into the driveway of his modest yet dignified suburban home, the reality of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him. His role as a senator carried with it the expectation of action. Tonight's events weren't just another personal affront, they were a mirror reflecting the systemic flaws he had spent his career addressing. Malcolm climbed out of the car, his feet crunching against the gravel as he approached his front door. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. He paused for a moment, glancing at the sky. The stars were faint, obscured by the ambient light of the city. Yet, in their dim flicker, he found a fleeting sense of calm. Inside, the silence greeted him like an old friend. He set his briefcase on the entryway table and loosened his tie, allowing himself a moment to breathe. But the reprieve was short-lived. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, a reminder that the night's events had not gone unnoticed. He retrieved the device, his thumb swiping across the screen to reveal a flood of notifications. Social media was ablaze with videos and commentary from the roadside encounter. Hashtags bearing his name were trending, accompanied by clips of his calm exchanges with the officers and the crowd's defiant support. One video, in particular, had already garnered millions of views. It captured the pivotal moment when Officer Taylor had spoken up, challenging his partner's actions. The caption read, "Courage in the face of injustice, watch as a young officer takes a stand." Malcolm sank into the leather armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the phone. The world was watching, and the momentum of this moment was undeniable. Yet, the senator knew the danger of fleeting virality. Public outrage could spark change, but it often fizzled out before meaningful action could take root. His thoughts were interrupted by another notification, this one an incoming call. The name on the screen made his stomach tighten. Angela Pierce, he muttered under his breath. She was a veteran journalist known for her incisive interviews and relentless pursuit of the truth. If Angela was calling, it meant the story had already reached the national stage. Malcolm hesitated for a moment before answering. "Good evening, Angela." Senator Ray, Angela's voice was sharp but professional, tinged with urgency. "I assume you know why I'm calling." "I can guess," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "I've seen the footage," she said. "It's powerful. People are calling it a turning point. But they need to hear from you directly." Malcolm sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And what exactly do they need to hear?" "The truth," Angela said simply. "Not just about tonight, but about everything it represents. You've built your career on tackling systemic inequities. This is your chance to show the public what that fight looks like in real time." He considered her words carefully. Angela wasn't wrong, the encounter was more than a personal ordeal, it was a symbol of the broader struggle for accountability and justice. But Malcolm also knew the risks of stepping into the media spotlight. Every word, every gesture would be dissected, praised by some and weaponized by others. "I'll give you an interview," he said finally, his voice firm. "But only if it focuses on solutions, not sensationalism. I won't be another pawn in the cycle of outrage without action." Angela's tone softened. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Let's make it happen." After ending the call, Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The weight of the night felt heavier now, but it was balanced by a growing sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim of prejudice, he was a voice for change, and he intended to use that voice wisely. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at his office to find his team already abuzz with activity. His chief of staff, Elena Martinez, greeted him at the door, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We've got a situation, Senator," she said, walking briskly alongside him. "I'm aware," Malcolm replied. "What's the public response looking like?" "Overwhelmingly positive," Elena said, handing him a stack of reports. "The footage has struck a nerve. People are demanding accountability, not just from the officers involved, but from the entire system." "And the opposition?" "They're framing it as another instance of anti-police sentiment," Elena said, rolling her eyes. "But the support for you far outweighs the criticism. Even some moderates are calling for an investigation into the department." Malcolm nodded, his mind already racing with strategies. "We need to move quickly. Draft a statement calling for a formal review of the precinct's policies and training programs. I also want to meet with Officer Taylor. His courage deserves recognition." Elena hesitated. "And Officer Nichols?" "We let the investigation handle him," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "Our focus is on systemic change, not personal vendettas." As the day wore on, Malcolm found himself immersed in back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and media preparations. The momentum from the encounter was undeniable, but he knew how fragile public attention could be. Every step had to be deliberate, every message clear. That evening, Malcolm sat in the studio across from Angela Pierce, the bright lights casting harsh shadows on the otherwise sleek set. The cameras rolled, and Angela wasted no time diving into the heart of the matter. "What was going through your mind during the encounter?" she asked, her tone probing but respectful. Malcolm leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "What went through my mind wasn't just my experience, it was the experiences of countless others who've faced similar situations without the privilege of a title or a platform. I was thinking about how many of them don't walk away from those encounters unscathed." Angela's expression softened. "And what do you hope comes from this moment?" "Change," Malcolm said firmly. "Not just in the way law enforcement operates, but in the way we as a society address the biases that underpin those operations. This isn't about villainizing officers, it's about holding systems accountable and building trust through transparency." The interview continued, each question digging deeper into Malcolm's vision for reform. By the end, it was clear that his message had resonated, not just with Angela, but with the millions watching from their homes. As Malcolm left the studio that night, he felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was prepared. The encounter on that quiet highway had been a catalyst, but the real work was just beginning. Bridging the divide. The next day, Malcolm Ray stood before a packed auditorium, the hum of anticipation filling the room. This was not a planned event. It had been organized spontaneously by local activists, community leaders, and supporters who saw his ordeal as a rallying cry for action. The turnout was staggering. People from every walk of life had gathered, students, clergy, small business owners, activists, and even off-duty officers. At the podium, Malcolm adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, but he welcomed it. Every individual in the room represented a shared purpose, a collective will to address the fractures that had long been ignored. "Good evening," Malcolm began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Thank you all for being here. It's a testament to our shared values that so many of you have taken the time to stand together, to demand change, not just for me, but for every person who has ever been silenced, marginalized, or dismissed." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. "I've spent much of the past 24 hours reflecting on what happened on that quiet stretch of highway," he continued. "I've thought about the officers, the crowd that gathered, and the countless people who've reached out to share their own stories. And I've realized something: this moment isn't just about me or even about the two officers involved. It's about all of us. It's about what kind of society we want to be. Malcolm paused, scanning the room. But let me be clear, change is not something that comes easily. It requires courage, commitment, and often, uncomfortable conversations. That's why I've asked someone to join me here tonight, someone who represents both the challenges we face and the potential for reconciliation. The crowd murmured, curious about who Malcolm was referring to. As he gestured to the side of the stage, Officer Ethan Taylor stepped into view. His presence drew a mixed reaction, some cheers, some hesitant murmurs, and a few scattered boos. Taylor stood awkwardly at first, his hands clasped in front of him. The young officer's face bore the weight of recent events, but there was a resolve in his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. Malcolm motioned for him to join him at the podium. Officer Taylor, Malcolm said, made a choice that night. In the face of pressure, he chose to prioritize integrity over complicity. That choice took courage, and it's a choice we need to see more of in our institutions. Taylor stepped forward, clearing his throat. I didn't expect to be standing here tonight, he began, his voice trembling slightly. To be honest, I'm still trying to process everything. But what I do know is that I joined this job to protect and serve, not to discriminate, not to intimidate, and certainly not to perpetuate injustice. The crowd listened intently as Taylor spoke, his words unpolished but sincere. When I saw Senator Ray that night, I knew something wasn't right, not with him, but with the way we approached the situation. And I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in something I didn't believe in. So, I spoke up. And I'll keep speaking up, because accountability starts with each of us. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Taylor's admission sinking in. Then, a slow clap began, building into a wave of applause. The young officer's vulnerability had struck a chord, even among those who had initially doubted him. Malcolm placed a hand on Taylor's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "This is what progress looks like," he said, addressing the audience. "It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it requires bravery on all sides. But if we can come together, if we can see each other not as enemies but as partners in this fight for justice, then we can achieve something extraordinary." One evening, months after the fateful encounter, Malcolm returned to the same stretch of highway where it had all begun. He parked his car on the shoulder, stepping out into the cool night air. The road was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. As he stood there, Malcolm reflected on the journey, on the pain, the progress, and the people who had joined him along the way. This wasn't the end of the fight, it was merely the beginning. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that the road ahead, while challenging, was one worth traveling. A legacy forged in fire. The state legislature chamber was filled to capacity, the air charged with anticipation. Senators, representatives, activists, and reporters packed the room, their collective focus riveted on the man standing at the podium. Malcolm Ray adjusted his tie, his usually steady hands betraying a slight tremor. He was about to present the culmination of months of relentless work, a landmark bill aimed at overhauling policing and accountability in the state. The room quieted as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at a crossroads," Malcolm said, his voice steady but resolute. The events of that night on the highway were not an anomaly, they were a symptom of deeper fractures within our society. But this bill is not about blame, it's about building something better. The Justice in Policing and Equity Act was a sweeping piece of legislation. It proposed mandatory de-escalation training for officers, independent civilian oversight boards, and increased transparency in law enforcement procedures. It also allocated funds for community programs aimed at addressing the root causes of crime, such as poverty and lack of education. "This is not just a law enforcement issue," Malcolm continued. "This is a societal issue. If we truly want justice, we must address the systemic inequities that fuel mistrust and perpetuate harm. This bill is a first step, not a final solution, but a necessary beginning. The chamber erupted in applause, though pockets of resistance were evident. Several lawmakers exchanged skeptical glances, their folded arms signaling their dissent. But Malcolm was undeterred. Over the past few months, I've sat with officers, community leaders, and families who've been directly impacted by these issues. I've listened to their pain, their fears, and their hopes. This bill reflects their voices. He paused, scanning the room. We cannot let fear of change paralyze us. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to act. The debate over the bill was intense. Opponents criticized it as overreaching, claiming it would tie the hands of law enforcement and jeopardize public safety. Proponents argued that the status quo was untenable, pointing to a growing chorus of voices demanding reform. Malcolm navigated the discussions with the same calm composure he had displayed on the roadside that fateful night. He met with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, addressing their concerns and finding common ground where possible. He worked tirelessly, revising provisions and building coalitions, knowing that every compromise brought him closer to passing the bill. Meanwhile, the public's engagement remained high. Town halls and rallies drew massive crowds, and social media platforms buzzed with discussions about the proposed reforms. Malcolm's leadership had turned a moment of injustice into a movement, galvanizing people across the state and beyond. Officer Ethan Taylor became an unexpected ally in the fight. His decision to speak out against his partner had not only reshaped his career but also his understanding of what it meant to serve his community. He worked alongside Malcolm to advocate for the bill, sharing his perspective as an officer willing to embrace change. Accountability doesn't weaken us, Taylor said at a public forum. It makes us better. It builds trust. And trust is the foundation of effective policing. As the weeks wore on, the momentum grew. Polls showed increasing public support for the bill, and several key lawmakers who had initially been opposed began to shift their positions. By the time the final vote was scheduled, it was clear that the bill had a strong chance of passing. On the day of the vote, Malcolm sat in his office, his gaze fixed on the framed photograph of his parents on his desk. They had been his first role models, instilling in him the values of integrity and resilience. He thought about their sacrifices, about the struggles they had endured to give him the opportunities he now had. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Elena, his chief of staff. "Senator Ray, it's time," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Malcolm nodded, rising from his chair. He adjusted his tie one last time and followed her to the chamber. The roll call vote began, each name called out echoing in the chamber. Malcolm's heart pounded as the tally grew, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. When the final vote was announced, 52 in favor, 48 against, a wave of relief and triumph swept through him. The room erupted into cheers and applause. Supporters hugged and shook hands, their faces lit with hope. Malcolm allowed himself a brief smile, but he knew the passage of the bill was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the implementation of the new law began. Police departments across the state underwent mandatory training, and independent oversight boards were established in every major city. Community leaders were given seats at the table, ensuring that marginalized voices were included in decision-making processes. The changes were not without challenges. Some officers resisted the reforms, while others embraced them as an opportunity to rebuild trust. Malcolm visited precincts, community centers, and schools, listening to feedback and addressing concerns. His presence served as a reminder that the fight for justice required continued vigilance and collaboration. Months later, Malcolm stood at the opening of a new community resource center in one of the neighborhoods most affected by systemic inequities. The center, funded by the legislation, offered job training, counseling services, and educational programs. As he cut the ribbon, surrounded by community members and local officials, Malcolm felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the tangible result of his efforts, a step toward healing and empowerment. A young boy approached him, clutching a small notebook. "Senator Ray," the boy said shyly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Malcolm replied, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "How did you stay so brave when those officers stopped you?" the boy asked. Malcolm smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It wasn't just bravery," he said. "It was faith, faith that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can make a difference. And you know what? You have that same strength inside you." The boy grinned, clutching his notebook tightly. As Malcolm rose, he looked out at the gathering of people, the faces of a community coming together to build a better future. The road ahead was still long, but in that moment, he felt confident that they were moving in the right direction. And for Malcolm Ray, that was the true measure of success, not just passing laws, but creating a legacy of hope, resilience, and lasting change.